Hello, welcome to this module on risk assessment and life cycle analysis as part of the Ecology and Environment course. My name is Ravi Krishna from the Chemical Engineering Department at IIT Madras. In the next few lectures, we will be discussing aspects about health risk assessment and several factors that cause health risk, and we will also discuss why, how we can manage this kind of health risk. So, this slide shows a general overview of what we will be addressing in this particular module. So, public health concerns about health effects due to environmental factors. We know that we see newspaper news in the media, public media, and also we see it around us. Sometimes there are a lot of concerns about public health. The earliest big large scale incident about public health was the London smog somewhere in the mid 20th century, where there was a lot of smoke in London and people did not know where it was coming from. It was around about the 1940s or 50s, and in the 50s around World War II that time, and people did not know where it was coming from, and it caused a major outcry and a public health problem. That was one of the first instances of that. The other instance is smog in Los Angeles, and more recently dust in New Delhi. So, these are all issues that the public faces when we are looking at a certain issue in the public domain, and people are worried about it, and then we seek answers. And the questions that are raised as these kind of health effects are were these health effects observed earlier? That's the first question people ask us, is something that is new and it was not seen earlier. And the next question obviously is, what is causing these health effects? So, there is some factor that is responsible for these health effects. And in the case of London smog and in the Los Angeles smog and dust in Delhi, it is visible. So, the physical manifestation in the cities, whether preceded the health effects, and people obviously were afraid that something will happen to their health. But oftentimes you do not see that, you do not see a physical manifestation. You first see the health effect, and then one tries to investigate what is the cause of these kind of problems. For example, you might have a health effect that is arising from drinking water from a particular well, but you may not even see what is causing it, and so therefore investigation of those kind of effects becomes much more difficult. But it all comes under the same scope, in that there are health effects, and then we would like to know what is causing them, and is it because of pollution? Because sometimes people assume that pollution is a cause of it, and the reason we do that, whenever we have health effects, there are multiple reasons why one can have health effects. One can be one can have a genetic predisposition to that, or a particular which is nothing related to an environmental factor. So, these kind of reasons also exist for health effects. So, we would like to isolate if it is an environmental reason that is causing this problem. So, and if it is established that it is because of pollution into the environment, the next question one would like to ask is, who is causing it, who is responsible, and this comes to the question of liability. The liability is a very important aspect. We will discuss this briefly in one of the modules later. So, who is responsible? Because as we talk about, there are different cases in our society where one particular section of the society is responsible for environmental pollution, and the rest of the society has to bear the consequences, which is health risk or any other form of risk. Then there is a responsibility of the person who is polluting to take care of it, to pay for it, and the scope of that is what is classified as liability. And then the next question people ask is, okay, it is done, the damage is done, or it is being done, so we know who is responsible. So, is it possible to control or remedy the ill effects of pollution? And this comes under the purview of what we call as environmental management. And the next question, when you do all this, there is a cost involved in this, and so that is who will pay for it. This comes under liability and also compensation. So, there are health effects, which means there is going to be expenses, medical expenses, and there are some compensation is given either to a society at large or to the government or some such entity which is determined after an investigation. And the last question that one would like to ask is it possible to predict this health risk? And what we mean by predicting this health risk is there are different classes by which or different types of events by which this kind of health risk can arise. One is due to normal operation, business as usual. People are doing something, some activity, and as a result of that we would like to know if a health risk can be predicted based on that activity. The second aspect is if there is a sudden accident, that kind of thing, would it be possible for us to predict an emergency response or prepare ourselves for an emergency response? The idea of health risk assessment or risk assessment in general, risk assessment is a term used very widely. It is used for economic risk, it is used for environmental health risk, it is used for financial risk, it is used for other things also, social risk assessment. So, in the entire purview of risk assessment, health risk is very important because it pertains to human beings, and therefore we are asking all these questions. And finally, we would like to ask, is there an organized methodology? It seems like it should not be a knee-jerk reaction where something happens, or a reactive process where something happens and then we group around and try to evolve a solution. But is there an organized methodology where right from the beginning we incorporate the principles of the risk assessment and reduce, when we do risk assessment, it implies that we have a goal for reducing the risk, and therefore can we implement these principles right at the stage of the design. And this is where this life cycle analysis, or LCA, and the associated tools that we use with it comes into play. Along with this, there is also organizations which are regulatory bodies and international bodies, agencies which also have guidelines. One of those is the ISO guidelines, the ISO number for environmental assessment. They have they keep revising their guidelines, and in order to help people to plan this process of risk assessment in a more organized manner. So, with this introduction, we'll go ahead in this module, in this particular lecture, and talk about environmental health risk and the definition of that. So, we address the following questions: what is environmental health risk in this particular lecture, and then how does it happen, and how do we characterize it, in the sense how do we quantify it, because we need solutions. We need also to quantify risk, because there may be several risks and we would like to know which one is the more severe one, so we can address that first, because our resources are limited. And there are different types of health risk, and how can technology help in this. And this lecture and the following lectures, there are a few lectures that we will cover this question in. One of the things that has come out of in the discussions also in the other modules, when we talk about ecology and environment, we also talk about economics as a consequence, or as a very important factor in it, which determines how effectively we do some of these things. For example, in the previous slide we said there is liability, there is compensation and all that, and the reason why people are focused on this is all of this costs money. Doing environmental health risk assessment and preventing it and managing it costs money, and in general people see environmental management as an overhead. What we mean by overhead is it is not essential to the economic activity of a particular process. It is seen as an externality, it is seen as something, it is as a nuisance in some sectors. So, the goal in the current scenario, in the way the governance is going, is that we would like to incorporate environmental management into the basic design of a particular process, whoever the process may belong to. It may be an industry, it may be a government, it may be any other agency that is trying to do something, including remediation work. Okay. So, what are we really worried about? We are worried about health effects such as respiratory ailments, which include shortness of breath, allergy, some problem with the stomach, gastric ailments, or long-term illnesses such as cancer, or effect to other critical organs, and a lot more. So, when we look in newspapers, we are always concerned that we have an ailment, we would like to see if there is an external factor involved in it, and this external factor usually is an environmental factor. For example, how do we get these health effects? This one possibility, as I mentioned earlier, is a predisposition of the body to react to certain things, but sometimes it is also inherent. There may be a deficiency that may be happening, but there are environmental factors that may be responsible for this. The most commonly seen environmental effect is allergy, nasal allergies. When we go out in the road, many people suffer from nasal allergies. We have runny nose, we have sneezing, and that kind of thing. And so we know, we can relate that we have a respiratory ailment, so it must be something that we breathe, something in the air that we breathe. The air is clean, we usually do not expect this kind of behavior, but if there is something harmful in the air we breathe, we may have a respiratory ailment. So similarly, if something is there in the food or the water we drink, we may get ailments to the digestive system or other internal organs, and we also can have ailments to the skin or eyes when we have direct contact with these harmful substances. In the environmental jargon, the method by which a chemical can get into the body or a person can get exposed to a particular harmful substance is called as an exposure to that particular medical, and there are different pathways, as we have discussed here already. If you breathe, it is called as an inhalation pathway, and if we eat, it is called as an ingestion pathway, and if you come in contact with it for eyes and the skin, it is called as a dermal pathway. So these pathways are related to media in the environment. So we have in the environment, we have air, we have soil, and we have water. The three are the major compartments in the environment. We also have sediment. Sediment is something is the mud that is present underwater in lakes, rivers, or ocean floor. We also have animals and plants that live in these media, which survive in this media, which rely on this environmental media. Together, we call this as the environment. So when we are talking about environmental pathways, we are talking in relation to human beings. So humans are taking material from the components of the environment. So we eat, we breathe the air, we drink the water. We also rely on the animals and plants for our food. And so if there is a harmful substance, and so the human beings here are called as the receptors. A receptor is a general term that is used in environmental, in the convention of environmental sciences, is anything or anybody who receives a particular substance. So this can be anything. A receptor need not be a human being, it can be a plant, it can be an animal, it can be air, water, soil, or a building. So in the overall context of this, we do not differentiate between the classes of receptors. Anything can be a receptor, a sensor can be a receptor. So it is a general term, but in our context, we are worried about human health risk assessment. So our receptor here in most of the cases is a human being, and let us say there is a substance A that does not belong to the environment. So it is a natural environment, it is not there. So it is a substance that is introduced. So in the context of things, when we are talking about health risk assessment, we have a health effect and we want to know what is the cause of this. We are saying, is pollution a cause of this? And the reason we ask is there are some natural causes also which can cause some of these ailments. For example, pollen is released by trees, by flowers in a particular season, and we all know that during a particular season people are very susceptible to nasal allergies. They say it's this season and a lot of pollen is in the air, and therefore certain cities have a lot of pollen, and therefore somebody is susceptible to this kind of this thing. And that is the reason I classify this as a substance not belonging to the environment, which is the signature of pollution. Somebody is doing something which does not belong in nature, and therefore if it is released in the environment, so what happens? So if a substance that does not belong in the environment comes through and it goes into every part of the environment, and if it enters every phase of the environment, then it can enter the human beings, and when it enters human beings, and over a period of time, a constant exposure of this particular environmental phase to human beings this thing grows, it accumulates in the human being, and at a certain point when it accumulates, the human receptor can fall sick. So, this in general is the exposure pathway, and then it will manifest as health effects. So, toxicology is a term that is used in order to formalize this health effect. So, the health effect is an effect. Toxicology is the reason why one may have a health effect. So, when we talk about health effect, there are two kinds of health effects. One is called as an acute health effect, which is where the effects are seen immediately, a very short time scales. For example, these time scales are seconds, minutes and hours. So, for example, if you go into a room where there is a harmful chemical, immediately your eyes are irritated, or you have sneezing, you know that it is a quick effect, it is acute effect, but it is quick, it is fast. And some of these acute effects can also lead to fatalities in certain cases where extremely poisonous substances are there, and it can lead to fatalities. On the other hand, we have something called as chronic effects, where the effects are not observed immediately, and physiological effects are seen after a prolonged exposure and are manifest. What we mean by manifest is symptoms start showing up very late, and sometimes it can be months, years or even decades before it shows up, and for the same reason why it has to show up, for it to show up, it needs to accumulate in the body to some certain extent. And several categories of chronic effects, we have gradual internal organ damage, then we have teratogenicity, which is birth defects, mutagenicity, which is transmitted by genes to the next generations, and then we have carcinogenicity, which is cancer causing. So, there are different chemicals that are known or are suspected to cause cancer or suspected to cause some of these things, and we will see what we mean by suspected reasons. So, chronic effects are in sense more dangerous because we do not see the effect immediately. Somebody is exposed to something for a short period of time, they say everything is fine, they go on with their business, and they keep doing it for 10 years without realizing that there has been a slow exposure over a period of time, and therefore they may be exposed to something that may cause a long term ailment. So, that is called as a chronic effect. And a lot of things that we see in the environment in terms of pollution and contamination and the health effects come under this category, because the concentrations of some of these chemicals are very small, but due to accumulation over a long period of time, it can cause an effect. So, we need an index of toxicity or what we mean by index is the following. So, there are two different substances A and B have different toxicity, say mercury and common salt. So, obviously 1 milligram of mercury, if you ingest 1 milligram of mercury and 1 milligram of salt, the effect is not the same. So, 1 milligram of mercury is likely to be more hazardous and more dangerous, more toxic to a human being than 1 milligram of salt. So, in order to characterize the toxicology, we use what is called as a dose response curve. So, dose response curve is a relationship of the response of a receptor, like such as a human being, to the amount of substance that is ingested by the receptor. So, in this, the dose response can be a straight line like this, which says that for every non-zero amount of material that is ingested, there is a positive response, there is a certain response, which is called as a no threshold response. There are also responses which is called as a threshold, where below a certain dose nothing happens, there is no response at all. And there are also things like non-linear responses here. So, one of the things that one has to keep in mind is dose response. The response is only limited by the way in which we can measure the response. So, as we have gone ahead in technology, in medical diagnostics technologies, this response, our sensitivity of the responses, which means the capacity, the capability of for us to detect a response has also increased, and therefore we are now able to see a lot more response of health effects symptoms that earlier we were unable to see until it reaches a certain point. This directly relates to technological advances in diagnostics and in the ability for us to measure certain components in the system. So these dose response relationship curves will change over a period of time as and when we have new information available. So, this is not set in stone, and this is liable to change as so you keep hearing news reports that some substance which 20 years back was considered to be safe is now considered unsafe. That is because we know more about the response, because we are able to measure responses more accurately now than 20 years ago. So, a response is a measurable effect in health, and but then we are worried about human health, and how do we measure human health? So, if we take 10 people in a classroom who are sitting and I am working on a blackboard with a chalk piece, and 2 of them start sneezing when I work with the blackboard and when I erase the dust on the blackboard. So, the problem is there is a lot of all the receptors, and we know that from practical experience, that in a given population of receptors, all of them do not behave in the same way for a particular stimulus. If you have a pollutant that is in this room, that is present in the air at a certain concentration, all of us are not going to be experiencing the same level of response, and therefore that provides a challenge, and it forces us to use statistics as a tool for determining quantitative markers for these kind of things. So, when we are dealing with large populations, we are dealing with society at large. So, if you are dealing with a population in India which is close to 1 billion, we need to make decisions, policy decisions based on these kinds of responses, and therefore that becomes a problem, and you have to use statistics as a tool that will help us make decisions. And we are not going to talk about statistics in this course, but it is important to keep in mind that a dose response curve is only as good as its statistical validity, and that one has to keep that in mind. But we cannot measure health effects directly in human beings. There are ways to do it in what is called as epidemiology. It is also a statistical tool. Say we have 100 students in the class, 20 of them fall sick. Whenever I open a blackboard, I start writing on blackboard, which means that there is some relationship between me writing on the blackboard and their health effects. So, that is an indirect statistical relationship. It does not have direct proof. You can only have direct proof if you have physiological evidence, and sometimes it is not easy to get live physiological evidence. Now it is becoming even easier to do it, but in general it is not easy because it requires the consent of the human being, and therefore that is not easy. So, we are also talking about toxicology, which means that we would like to know what is the toxicity of a particular chemical that I am going to produce now. If I am going to manufacture something which has properties, useful properties for other things that we do, and this is the crux of this module, in that we are trying to make some process, some material that has usefulness in some other aspect of our society, but then we would like to know what is the impact of this. So, in other words, risk assessment is also known as impact assessment or environmental impact assessment or health impact assessment. So, we can't use it on human beings. We can't take a new chemical and dose human beings with it and say what happens to them. That defeats the entire purpose of this. So, people have used surrogates such as animals in order to test things, and you see this very often. We see that this product, certain products are, you will see labels saying that certain products have been tested on animals. And it has shown especially mammals, because that is similar to the system that human beings have, and it is shown that the response is similar to that of human beings. And there has been a lot of controversy about this, and some people do not like doing this, and many corporations have moved away from this kind of systems, and we see a whole societal response to these kind of things. So, as a population also we are divided in this kind of responses, but something to keep in mind. More recently, we have biological methods and biochemical methods that we do not have to do this anymore. We can directly take a particular tissue and then see the response of a particular chemical on that, and so we chalk the entire biochemical response of the system in a human body, where it goes and all that. So, but in the system where we use animals, some examples of the toxicity indices such as that represent the dose response curve are examples such as the LD50, which is lethal dose 50, which indicates that there is a mass that will kill 50% of the test population. This is the mass of a chemical or a dosage of a chemical that will kill 50% of the population. This 50% is important because again we talk about susceptibility of different components of a population, different individuals in a population to a particular dose. So, we need some kind of limit, more than 50%, which means it is acceptable, which is a significant amount of risk, not acceptable. It's a significant amount of risk that is posed to the population, and therefore it may be taken seriously. This is of course controversial, because in a population of whatever be the population, always the difficult question to answer is what is acceptable risk. So, in this case it says that at this dose of chemical 50% of the population may suffer a fatality. So, is it okay if 1 in a million suffers a fatality, and is that acceptable health risk? And this is a very difficult question to answer from a societal point of view, and as we do several things in our society, sometimes these kind of questions are linked to economics. So, if we say that having an automobile, running cars on the road has a risk of 1 in a million, so 1 in a million person can have a serious health effect because of vehicles on the road. So, if we are very strict about it, we say we should ban all vehicles, we should ban all combustion devices in our society, and our society will collapse. So, here is where I think the concept of sustainability comes into play, and it is not an easy question to answer, as you would have already realize from the material presented in the other modules about sustainability, that it is not an easy question to answer. So, it is a question that requires the participation of society at large, even to determine what is an acceptable health risk, and this is something for all of you to ponder about when you look at some of the data and the statistics about these kind of things. So, as I had mentioned earlier, we focus our discussion on human beings as primary receptors, but we also extend it to other components in the environment. We should, and because they are all related to us in some way or the other. So, this is the argument that is placed by most people who say that if you have to protect our environment, it is for the future generations. So, and the environment must be given a chance to regenerate itself, so that it is. So, as a result of this toxicology discussion, it now is mandatory that every material that is produced must be tested for toxicology. So, whenever you have a material that is produced by a company, they have something called as the material and safety data sheet, which contains all this information. It must contain toxicology information and exposure information, which means if I am exposed to it by inhalation or by drinking or by skin contact, what will happen? And these numbers must be presented, and they must be tested and validated by a government regulatory agency before it can get into the environment. So, so based on our toxicology effects, we can infer that toxicity is likely to be higher for higher mass of ingestion. A general rule that we have is that the mass the dose that we ingest is equal to concentration multiplied by the volume. For example, if you drink 4 liters of water every day, and ingestion of a chemical A in 1 day through the water, if there is a chemical A in the water that you find, how much of A in the water is acceptable? So, if the concentration, or that is the mass of A per liter of water multiplied by 4 liters of water a day will give you the amount that you are ingesting every day, and this therefore dependent on the concentration and the time of exposure. So, over a period of time you are going to be accumulating a certain amount. The same calculation can be done for the air we breathe. If there is a chemical in the air, we are breathing about at a rate of 2 to 8 liters per minute, and you can calculate how much of air. All this assumes that this chemical is accumulating in the body and not metabolizing, because the body also has the capacity to react, to transform this chemical into something more benign or something more dangerous. Both of these things can happen in the body. Or the body also has the capacity to filter it out, so nothing may happen, it may just come out, but we do not know. What we, in this context, we take an approach that is called as a conservative approach. We say, we call it as a worst case scenario. In the worst case, what will happen? So, if you take a worst case scenario, one of the advantages, one of the utilities of this equation that I have presented here is that you can determine what is this concentration that is acceptable in water. If you are alive for say 80 years, or 80 years you drink 4 liters of water a day, how much of concentration of A is acceptable in the. So, this is a basis for determining standards for water quality and air quality. So, you can see that it is a big long equation, the sequence of things that need to happen in order to determine the standards, and the standards also imply that how much of money should I spend in treating the air and water, and how should I manage it. So, we have seen that this is there. Where does this A come from? The next question we ask is, so it is there in the environment, we are exposed to it, so we are falling sick. So, where does it come from? That is the next question, and it comes from somewhere, it comes from a source, something is responsible for it, and it is releasing it at some rate, and it is getting into the environment. Different types of sources can be based on processes. For example, we have combustion, construction, demolition. This is a very limited set of processes. Everything that we do for our daily lives is a process. So, me writing on the blackboard is a process. So, that is itself a thing. It may not be very significant, it may be applicable only to a small group of population. But this classification is done based on the activity or on based on the product. So, you have erosion, manufacturing or waste disposal. On the basis of a product we have consumer goods, we have energy production, whether it is a power plant or a nuclear power plant or anything like that. And we have specialty chemicals, we have medicines, we have technological appliances such as cell phones, and we have vehicles. Okay. And when we have sources, we have pollutants coming out of sources, we have the chemicals of concern or pollutants of concern that can come here, can get into air, water. They can also be present as suspended solids in water. They can be present as particulate matter suspended in air. They can be organic or inorganic. These are all classifications that people can come up with. And sometimes there are specific chemicals that come out only from a particular kind of industry, and it is easy for us to check. And based on this toxicological index and the exposure. So, chemicals are ranked. There are lakhs of chemicals that we manufacture. If you open any catalog of a chemical company, and so how do we rank them? We have to rank them because some of these chemicals are used in such small quantities they may never get into the environment, and even if they do, they are in such small quantities. So, the ranking is done based on the amount that gets into the environment and also the exposure that we are likely to have. And so, a combination of this will give you a toxicity index that these chemicals have to be ranked in this particular manner. So, it is not sufficient that a process uses a hazardous material. We have seen that exposure is important, and how that the chemical from a particular source goes to the environment and then goes to the receptor, which we call as in the second line, which says how does material A travel from a source to the environment and to a receptor, how long does it take, and can we intervene. So, this is the next set of questions that we logically will ask, and these will be answered in our next lecture.